Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the northern direction, about the line of combat contact where the Russians continue their offensive operation. And we see that the Russian offensive operation in the direction of the city of Sumy is gaining momentum. Today, according to several mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to establish almost complete control over the village by the name of Adalahi. I'll remind you that during the previous 2 days, the Russians managed to take under complete control the village by the name of Belovody and the village by the name of Volodymyrovka. Furthermore, probably 4 days ago, the Russians reported that they managed to finish the battle for the settlement of Loknya. So now we see that Ukrainians can't hold their lines. We see that the Russians are moving further, and we are waiting for additional updates about the settlement of Novonikolaevka and Vodolahi, because most likely these two villages would be taken by the Russians in the very near future. And this will allow the Russians to shorten the distance to the village of Yablunovka and to the village of Yunakievka from the west. I'll remind you that currently the main purpose of the armed force of the Russian Federation is to get as close as possible to the main supply lines and to cut the village of Yunakievka from the mainland. As soon as the Russians are able to do this, then we can start counting days for the Ukrainian contingent on the territory of the village of Yunakievka. So I'll remind you that this is also a part of Russian secure zone operation. The Russians are trying to establish a secure zone along the border between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and we see that the Russians are pretty successful with this. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kharkiv direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Ukrainian sources published video where they were FPV droning and attacking Russians with FPV drones. In this video we can see, there are, as you can see, lots of episodes in the northern part of Ovchansk. In these episodes we may see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in different parts of the city of Ovchansk, mainly in the northern part, and based on this video we have adjusted the map. We have colored additional two blocks in the complete Russian control. For example, this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 26th of May of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of May of 2025. Now we see that the Russians most likely are trying to finish the battle for the northern part of Ovchansk by taking under control probably the last checkpoint and the last stronghold of the armed forces of Ukraine in this area. We're talking about these small facilities, these small industrial complex that's still under complete Ukrainian control. But due to these Russian activities, we expect that Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in the very near future. But despite Russian attempts, we see that Ukrainians have certain control over this area with FPV drones, and most likely the Ukrainians managed to damage the Russians. But anyway, while the Ukrainians were attacking Russians, the Russians managed to discover the most important. The Russians managed to discover the position of the armed forces of Ukraine FPV drone operators, and when the Russians discovered this, they began bombing and attacking this area. So now we expect that Russian further progress in the southern direction will face less resistance from the Ukrainian side. Once again, the battle for the northern part of the city of Ovchansk is about to be finished. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the area along the river Voskol. Today we have lots of very interesting updates. As you can see, we have adjusted the map and we have two changes. So let's compare the map. First of all, this is, for example, the map that you can see in front of your screen is the map by the end of the 26th of May of 2025. And during the previous night, we got several updates that confirmed additional progress on the ground. And the most important is that the Russians improved their positions along the border. Ukrainian sources published this video where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in different parts of the northeastern part of Kharkiv region. So there are lots of episodes how Ukrainians were attacking Russian strongholds, Russian positions. One of the Ukrainian strike was discovered exactly in this point. Another one took place to the northwest of the village of Kamenka. So based on this video we have adjusted the map, and now we see that the Russians are trying to advance further in the direction in the area of the northeastern part of Kharkiv region. Most likely the Russians are planning to attack something like this with the purpose to cut this pocket and to get additional territories under complete control. So now we see that the Russians are intensifying their activities in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region with the purpose most likely to establish complete control over these territories. We're talking about area between Russian border from the northeast and from the north. We're talking about the Pechenegi Reservoir, and we're talking about the river Voskol. I'll remind you that these territories used to be under complete Russian control in 2022 before the beginning of Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. Now the Russians, as we can see, are trying to restore control with these territories back. Now let's discuss the situation in the southern Kupiansk direction or the Lyman direction. As you can see, we have lots of icons. We have lots of proofs that the Russians managed to improve their positions. First, let's compare the maps. For example, this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 26th of May of 2025. The Russians just started the battle for the village of Redkadub. The Russians, according to several sources, managed to outflank the village from the south. The Russians continued their offensive operation with the purpose to outflank the village of Kolodys and Stavki, but yesterday it was just rumors and talks and nothing more. But when talking about the beginning of the 27th, we got additional confirmations from more reliable resources. As we can see, the Russians managed to maintain their positions, and furthermore we have geolocation from the southern part of the village of Redkadub. We will not watch this video because there are lots of violence, lots of episodes with violence where Ukrainians were attacking Russian soldiers along the village of Redkadub. Anyway, we have proofs that the Russians continue improving their positions, and the most important is that the Russians, according to information we have, managed to shorten the distance to the river of Nitrius. Currently, according to several mappers and several sources, the distance between the Russian edge positions and the river of Nitrius itself is less than 2 kilometers, which is obviously nothing. The Ukrainians most likely lost possibilities to use this road for supply and support of their contingent on the territory of Redkadub, and due to all these things, we expect that Ukrainians are about to be forced to fall back from this area further in the northern direction. As we can see, the Russians began offensive operation also in the southwestern and the southern direction. Currently, the Russians are trying to outflank the village of Zeleny Dolina, the village of Kolodysy. So basically, the Russians are turning in the southern direction with the purpose to begin their major offensive operation in the direction of the city by the name of Lyman. This is very important settlement, and if the Russians are able to take this village under complete control, we believe that this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in the city of Siversk and in the direction of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. So this is very important update. Of course, we are waiting for additional geolocations and videos because we have a very huge gap between geolocated positions and positions that were provided by different sources. Now let's talk about the Siversk direction. Today we got additional confirmation that the Russians control the village of Verkhnekamenska. The Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours carry out several counterattacks with the purpose to restore control over the western part of the village, but all those attacks carried out by the Ukrainians were repelled by the Russians. The Russians managed to save control over strategical positions and to dig even deeper. So the Russians currently control the village of Verkhnekamenska, and they have very strong control with this territory. We are waiting when the Russians will finish their regrouping and when the Russians begin another offensive operation in the southwestern direction with the purpose to take under control the village of Novosilovka. This will allow the Russians to maintain the lines, to shorten them, and to semi-encircle the city of Siversk from the southeast, east, and from the south. Now let's talk about the most important direction. We're talking about the Constantinoka direction and the Kliban-Bytsky pocket first of all. The Russians continue their offensive operation, and according to different sources and different mappers, the Russians managed to tighten the noose around Ukrainian positions in this area even harder. According to information we have, for example, this is the picture by the end of the 26th of May of 2025. Yesterday we got reports that the village of Stara Nikolaevka was second, that the village of Gnatovka was secured, that the Russians were about to finish the battle for the village of Zarya, and today we got additional reports. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take another tree line in the northern direction. Furthermore, several sources adjusted this pocket completely. We are talking about several pro-Russian resources. Several pro-Russian experts reported that this pocket was completely eliminated, but several additional pro-Russian resources reported that there are still pockets of resistance. So the Russians are trying to tell us that they managed to create a cauldron, and some pro-Russian resources reported that there are lots of Ukrainian soldiers and units were encircled by the Russians. We're not talking about thousands, but probably 2 battalions could be caught in cauldron by the Russians as a result of this offensive operation. And most likely, during the next several days, the Russians will be focused to secure and to clear this area. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation along N32 road, where the Russians managed to improve their positions as well. According to different sources, the Russians during the previous 24 hours, during the previous 48 hours, managed to break Ukraine defense. Basically, Ukraine defense in this area collapsed completely without any possibilities for restoring. So this is, for example, the situation by the end of the 24th of May of 2025, and we can see the progress on the ground almost every single day. And this is the situation, for example, by the end of the 26th of May, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of May. So according to information we have, the Russians answered both the village of Popoyar. Furthermore, several sources reported that this village was completely secured by the Russians. Furthermore, we got report that the Russians answered the village of Poltavka. This information was confirmed also by neutral mappers and by several pro-Russian resources. Furthermore, we got report that the Russians improved their positions and managed to outflank answer the village of Yablunovka from the west, and this is the most important piece of news. So several mappers reported that the Russians answered the village of Yablunovka from the west. So this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of May. If this information is correct, then this is going to be the beginning of complete disaster for Ukrainian lines to the south of the city of Constantinoka. Obviously, the Russians will continue advancing further in the eastern direction with the purpose to take this entire defense belt and this dense network of the fortifications. As soon as the Russians are able to take and to capture all these trenches and strongholds, this is going to be basically the complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in this area. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the western direction with the purpose to outflank the settlement of Nova Ekonomichna. Today, the Russians secured several strongholds and trenches to the north of Malinovka and to the northeast of Nova Ekonomichna. We're talking about this area. This is the situation, for example, by the end of the 26th of May, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 27th of May. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation from the village of Mirolubovka, and the Russians managed to answer the village and to secure the village of Mirna. At least this information was confirmed by several pro-Russian resources. So we understand that most likely the Russians would try to move further in the western direction with the purpose to establish complete control over this settlement. As soon as the Russians are able to take this pocket under complete control, this is going to be the beginning of probably creation of another cauldron for Ukrainians who are currently located in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. But when talking about the Pokrovsk agglomeration, obviously we are talking not about hundreds, we're talking about thousands of Ukrainians that could be caught without any possibility for evacuation or so. Furthermore, we got reports from the South Donetsk direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation. During the previous night, we got another video published by the Russian sources where we can see how Russians' drones were flying above the village of Alexeyevka, Novoukrainka, with different leaflets, different lists, and they were dropping these lists on the territories and the positions of Ukrainians, suggesting them to surrender. This is the pattern. We know that usually after such episode, after such things, the Russians begin their major offensive. So we expect that due to this video with let's say with the list to suggest with suggestions Ukrainians to surrender, we expect the Russians are going to begin their offensive operation in the area between the villages of Novoukrainivka, Zelený Kut, and the village of Alexeyevka, and this is going to happen probably, if not today, then during the next 24 hours. Furthermore, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west and to the east and northeast of the village of Fedorovka. This information was provided by pro-Russian resources. At the same time, the village of Fedorovka is under complete Russian fire control. The Russians are trying to pin down the Ukrainians and not to allow them to escape this area, or to probably to regroup themselves with the purpose to repel upcoming Russian attacks. So the situation here is very critical, and the Russians are getting closer and closer to this area. When talking about the villages of Zeleny Pole and Novopol, during the previous night we haven't received anything, so we still haven't received any confirmation whether the Russians managed to answer this area or not, but I'll remind you that several sources reported that both villages were already secured by the Russians. Furthermore, we got reports that the Russians began their full-scale and major offensive operation in the direction of Mala Takmachka, Novodanilovka, Novandrievka. The Russians are trying to attack both settlements from many directions, and according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Currently, it's very difficult to understand whether the Russians are going to begin their probably final offensive operation with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back from the village of Orekhov or not, or it's just attempts to distract Ukrainian attention and to pin down Ukrainian strategical reserves exactly in this area. So we see that it is very hard along the line of combat contact. We see that Ukrainians are in a very difficult situation. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.